Let's make our way over to the battery, directly to the negative battery terminal. I'm going to use a 10mm wrench and loosen the mounting nut just enough that I can remove the wiring from the battery itself. We'll set that aside so it's making no contact with the battery. Let's make our way over to the radiator cap. You want to be extremely careful and make sure that the radiator cap is cool to the touch. Essentially, you didn't just come back from a nice road test. Assuming it is cool, carefully press it down and turn it counterclockwise to remove it. As you start lifting it up, make sure you lift it up and away from your face. The next thing you want to do is inspect that radiator cap. Make sure it doesn't look torn, worn, or damaged in any way. Assuming it looks good, set it aside. Now let's make our way under the front of the vehicle. Commonly, there might be some sort of splash shield in this area. Ours is missing. If you did happen to have one, just go ahead and remove that now. The next thing you want to do is make your way up along the driver's side. You're going to be looking for the radiator. On the driver's side, lower aspect of the radiator is where you're going to find the drain. Now for this drain, if you were to just go ahead and start draining it now, it's going to come right down onto this cross member here. With that said, if you happen to have a piece of hose, you can carefully slide it over the end of the drain. Make sure it faces down to a collection bucket so you can recycle the fluid properly. I'll just take this hose, slide it up along the front of that cross member, and put it onto the drain. Now I'll put my collection bucket in place, and we'll go ahead and turn this counterclockwise until fluid starts coming out. Let that fully drain. All right, at this point it finished draining. Let's make sure we close the drain completely. We'll do that by turning it clockwise. Now the next thing we're going to do is safely raise and support the passenger side of the vehicle so we can remove our wheel. We'll do that by removing all 5 of our 21mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now with the wheel off of there, we want to carefully remove this whole plastic panel. Along this, you're going to find 2 10mm headed bolts inside the wheel well, but you also want to pay attention to the fact that it makes its way underneath the front of the vehicle. Now for us, we're missing some hardware up here. I can't tell you what's supposed to be there, but if it's a bolt or a push clip, just go ahead and remove it. Over here, like I said, we're going to remove 2 10mm headed bolts and 1 push clip. We'll start with the push clip. For this, you can either use a trim tool or a flat blade screwdriver. Once you have all your mounting hardware out of there, carefully remove the panel. Before we release tension on the belt, let's make our way up to the water pump pulley. Now for that pulley, you're going to have to loosen each of the 12mm headed bolts. You don't need to remove them, we just want to make sure they're loose. To help prevent the pulley from spinning, you can use a flat blade screwdriver or pry bar. I'll carefully get in between the shaft and one of the bolts. That way there, it doesn't spin on me while I continue loosening each of these mounting bolts. Try to get this last bolt loose, and then we can continue on by loosening our serpentine belt tensioner. Now to get the belt off of here to be able to do the alternator, it's going to be easiest from underneath the front passenger side of the engine. We'll carefully use a 19mm socket on a ratchet. I'm going to make my way up and try to find the tensioner. Once I have it on there, I'll continue on by twisting this clockwise to release tension. It's only going to go a little bit. After that, go ahead and slide the belt right off of that water pump pulley. The next thing we'll do is move the belt out of the way. We want to make sure that nothing gets on it and contaminates or damages it. The next thing we'll do is carefully remove each of our water pump pulley bolts. Now let's start disconnecting the electrical connectors from the alternator itself. We'll come over to this plastic cap, slide that out of the way. Underneath that, you're going to find a 10mm headed nut. We'll use some penetrant. Once you have the nut off of there, continue on by removing the wiring. We'll give it a quick inspection. We'll clean it up later. Set that aside. Now let's disconnect this wire. That's going to be easiest using a small blade screwdriver. We'll come right along the driver's side of that connector. There's a little tab. I'll gently get in between that area and pry. Now once I have it off of there, I'll just show you what it looks like. I carefully went in between this area and pried that tab up. After that, I just slid it off. Give it a quick check for corrosion, set that aside as well. Follow that wiring down the front of the alternator. You're going to find an area where it's pressed on there. It has a small push clip. I'll use a trim tool or even a small prying device and carefully get in between the area to separate it. Now let's make our way up here. For this, I'm just going to grab onto this clip. It has two little tabs. We'll grab those and gently separate this. We'll get that clip out of the way. We will be reusing it. Now right up on top of the alternator, you're going to find a bracket that holds the wiring to the top of the alternator. We'll use a 10mm to remove that bolt. Now we can start unbolting the alternator from the engine. You're going to find two mounting bolts for this. You'll have a 12mm down along the front bottom of the alternator. Along the top back side of the alternator, you'll have a 14mm bolt. Go ahead and remove the pair. I'll start with the 12mm. It's a little harder to get to. There it is. Now that we have the lower bolt out, continue on to your upper 14mm headed bolt. We'll fully remove that. Keep in mind, that's the last thing holding the alternator in place. Now let's use a pry bar between the alternator and the engine. We're going to gently try prying on the alternator just to try to separate it. Let's remove that alternator from the engine compartment. Let's carefully reach down here and we can remove our water pump pulley. Give that a quick inspection, clean it up, and set it aside. Okay, so we're at the point where we're going to start moving our crank position sensor wire off of the water pump. Looking along the top/front of it, you're going to find that it has a groove that the wire sits into. We'll carefully grab the wire and gently pull it out of its secured position. So now at this point, the wire is completely out of the way. We'll just slide this aside. Now we can start dismounting the water pump from the engine. You're going to find several bolts and a couple of nuts that make their way around. There is going to be some on the bottom of the water pump that'll be easier to get from underneath the vehicle. Now that we have the top area of the crank position sensor wire out of place, make your way back down under the passenger side of the engine. You're going to find that there's one more mounting area for that wire on the water pump. Let's carefully stick a pry bar or small screwdriver in that area and gently separate it. There we are. Now let's slide our coolant bucket underneath the water pump. Keep in mind, there could still potentially be coolant in the area. Now we can start removing some of our 10mm hardware. You'll find a nut and then 2 bolts as you make your way along the bottom of the water pump. Let's remove all 3 of those and then we'll get back up top for the rest. Now let's make our way back up top. Down along this area, you're going to find another mounting nut, a bolt, and that'll help us remove this bracket. Once you have that out of the way, deep down inside this area, there's one more 10mm headed mounting bolt. I'll start down here and start removing each of these. Now we can remove that bracket. That last one's just directly underneath this area. Now let's break the water pump free from the engine. The next thing we're going to do is start cleaning up the engine where the brand new water pump's going to be. Commonly, you're going to find a whole bunch of the existing gaskets still in place. Carefully use a scraper up against the aluminum engine block. Be extremely careful not to scour or damage the engine in any way. Once you have that so it's thoroughly cleaned down, continue on with your brand new gasket. Pay attention to the shape of the gasket. You want to make sure it matches up with the engine. We'll slide it right over those mounting studs and then grab our new water pump and get ready to install that as well. Be extremely careful not to damage your gasket as you do this. Let's start with that rearward upper bolt. We'll start that in there. Lightly bottom that out by hand. Now let's get our bracket back in place. Let's make our way under the vehicle and continue on with the rest of our mounting hardware. Start with the nut along the back side of the water pump. Put on each of the other bolts. Now we'll just make sure each of them are bottomed out and then we'll torque them to 80 inch-pounds. While we're down here, let's also resecure our crank position sensor wire. Now let's make our way back up top and continue tightening our hardware. Once you have all those torqued, continue remounting your wire into its secured position. As we slide it into place, be extremely careful not to damage it in any way. Double check it. Make sure it's completely secure. You do not want this falling out of place and potentially getting damaged on either your serpentine belt or the pulley. Now it's time to put on our pulley. We'll get this down in position, start in all of our mounting bolts and snug them up. Now before I go ahead and put the bolts on here, there's something that I want to mention. The torque for these is supposed to be 19 foot-pounds. As you can tell, there's minimal space in this engine compartment to be able to fit a torque wrench and a socket in the area. With that said, I used a little bit of blue thread locker, so once I make them tight, I know they'll stay secure. To tighten these, we'll just wedge something in between the mounting bolts, use our 12mm, and make sure they're all nice and tight. Now the next thing you want to do is just double check everything on that water pump. Once again, make sure that the wire is completely secured. All of your mounting bolts are torqued properly. After that, clean up your mess. You want to make sure there's no coolant on any of the pulleys, otherwise you could permanently damage your serpentine belt. Okay friends, it's time to install our alternator. Let's put this in place. The way it's going to sit inside on the engine is going to be like this. You're going to have the area with the two ears facing up and towards the engine. Down along the bottom, you have the singular ear. We'll slide this into place and then start in both of our mounting bolts. The upper bolt is going to be the longer bolt. Let's get that lower bolt started as well. Maneuver the alternator around as necessary. Typically, it's a good idea to get that lower bolt in there as far as you can by hand. Once you have both of those bolts snugged, continue on by torquing them. They'll each have a different torque. The upper bolt is 16 foot-pounds. The lower bolt is 38 foot-pounds. Now we're ready to start cleaning up our wire end. Looking at this one, you can tell it has a whole bunch of rust and corrosion. Make sure you clean both sides so it makes great contact with the alternator. Now we can start resecuring the wiring down along the bottom. We'll slide that into position. Continue on to your wiring harness. We'll press this in, listen for a click. Once you hear a click, give it a tug to make sure it's completely secure. Let's reconnect this area of the wiring. We'll slide it directly into place. Should slide down onto the alternator. Continue on with your mounting nut. We'll snug this up and then torque it to 87 inch-pounds. Continue on with your plastic protective cover. Slide that right around the wire. Press it onto the alternator, give it a wiggle so you're sure it's completely secured. Continue on to your 10mm headed bolt that holds the bracket to the top of the alternator. We'll start that in, make sure it's tight. Double check everything to make sure it's completely secure. Let's also put on our plastic clip. Slide it right on over the wires here and latch it in. Make sure it's secure. Okay friends, now it's time to install our serpentine belt. We'll start doing this from the top. I'll carefully slide it around the alternator, and then what I want to do is bring the top part of the belt all the way to the back, and you're going to find a pulley on the back side there. We'll slide it all the way around there as well. Now as we press it back there, we're going to carefully continue pressing it down using a prying device. Now that we have it around the power steering pulley, let's take the bottom half of that belt and we're going to carefully slide it over the idler pulley. As we do, we're going to try to pull up the tension on the belt to make sure we hold it on the power steering pulley fully. There we are. Now once you've got plenty of tension on that, let's make our way down underneath the passenger side of the engine. Now that we're under here, let's take the belt and pull it around the crank pulley. We're going to make sure we have the belt coming across here, and it goes across the AC compressor pulley. Now once you have it across there, you want to take the belt from across the top of the AC compressor and then bring it around your water pump pulley. Before we slide the belt over the water pump pulley, let's make sure we have our tool on the tensioner. Now once it's on there, we can start grabbing onto the belt. We're going to grab the belt directly up above the AC compressor pulley. We'll slide the belt from in between the alternator and the AC compressor pulley and then slide it over the water pump pulley while we pull on the tensioner. Let's slide this belt on there. This can be really tight at times. There we are. Now before I release tension, I'm just going to quickly look. I want to make sure the belt is sitting in all the grooves on all of my pulleys. Assuming it looks good, go ahead and release tension and then double check it. All right, so now we can go ahead and put on our corner piece here. We'll slide this up behind the wheel well area and line up our mounting bolt holes. Start in both of those mounting bolts and then snug them up. Now we can put in our push clip. Make sure you have it in the unlocked position, meaning the center is pulled out. Once you have it pressed in, lock it in by pressing in the center. The next thing you'd want to do would be to make your way across the front of the vehicle, making sure that you resecure the plastics along the way, and assuming you have the plastic that makes its way across the front, install that as well. Now we can get the wheel back up on here. Go ahead and start on all 5 of your lug nuts. Bottom them out, we'll get the wheel back on the ground and then torque it to 76 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely back down on the ground, let's torque these to 76 in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Let's make our way back over to the battery. We'll reconnect that negative battery terminal by pressing it down against the battery as far as possible. Tighten it up using your 10mm wrench. Make sure it's nice and tight. Okay friends, now it's going to be time to go ahead and fill our cooling system. Now there's several ways of doing this. The most common way would be with a funnel of some sort, so you don't spill anything. When it's time to fill it, you want to make sure that you use 50-50 pre-diluted coolant. If you do use concentrated coolant, make sure you mix it 50-50 with distilled water. Now what you're going to want to do is continue filling the cooling system until you see no more air bubbles making their way out of your funnel. Okay, so I filled it up to the point that I had no more air coming out of the coolant system. The next thing that I have to do is start up the vehicle. I'm going to let it run for a little while. What I'm going to see is more air bubbles making their way up through the funnel here. Once that stops and I have plenty of heat coming out of my vents, I'll make my way back out here and close this off so I can remove it from the system. Okay, so now that it's full and I'm sure that I burped out all the air in the system, I'll put back on my radiator cap. Now once you have this closed, the next thing that you want to pay attention to is the overflow tank. You can find the overflow tank by following that overflow hose all the way over towards the passenger side. Now commonly, it's a good idea to make sure that you replace the coolant that's inside the overflow as well. You just put brand new fluid inside the cooling system, why not replace this? You don't necessarily need to remove the entire overflow so you can recycle that fluid. Generally, you can just use something that looks a little bit like this and siphon the fluid right out. Make sure you dispose of it properly with the rest of your coolant. After that, make sure you fill this back up to the full line, which you can see down along the forward aspect of it. Once you're sure it's full, go ahead and close it off. Okay friends, we got the car back together. A few last things to think about. You want to make sure you start up the car and you have plenty of heat coming out the vents. Aside from that, make sure you don't have any coolant leaks, and then close the hood, take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.